Imagine standing on a tropical beach, watching the sun rise over an endless chain of emerald islands scattered across the Pacific like jewels on blue silk. This is the Philippines, 7,641 islands that have witnessed one of history's most remarkable stories of resilience, resistance, and rebirth. But this archipelago's story doesn't begin with Spanish conquistadors or American colonizers. It starts thousands of years earlier, with bold seafarers who dared to cross vast oceans armed with nothing but bamboo boats and an unshakable belief in their destiny. Long before the world knew the name Philippines, these islands pulsed with life. By around 3000 BCE, seafaring Austronesians, who form the majority of the current population, migrated southward from Taiwan. Picture this extraordinary migration. Families loading their bankers with everything they owned, following stars and ocean currents across hundreds of miles of open water. These were not desperate refugees. They were master navigators, whose maritime skills would eventually spread their culture from Madagascar to Easter Island. The Austronesians brought more than just people to these shores. They carried with them the seeds of civilization. Rice cultivation that would transform mountainsides into cascading green terraces, oral traditions that preserved the wisdom of generations, and a social system that would evolve into the barangay, the fundamental building block of Filipino society. These ancient barangays were coastal or riverine in nature, reflecting the maritime culture that defined early Filipino life. For nearly 3,000 years, the archipelago developed its own unique rhythm. The barangay system created a delicate balance of power where leadership was earned, not inherited. A datu ruled not through divine right, but through wisdom, strength, and the consent of the governed. Some barangays grew wealthy through trade with the great empires of Asia, the Majapahit of Java, the Srivijaya of Sumatra, and the Ming dynasty of China. Gold flowed through Filipino hands, Chinese porcelain graced their ceremonies, and Indian religious concepts merged with indigenous beliefs. But here's what made pre-colonial Philippines fascinating. It was never one unified nation. In the north, the Ifugao carved their legendary rice terraces into mountain slopes, creating what many consider the eighth wonder of the world. In the south, Islamic sultanates like Sulu and Maguindanao established themselves as major maritime powers, their fleets controlling trade routes throughout Southeast Asia. Along the coasts, warrior societies known as pintados, the painted ones, adorned their bodies with intricate tattoos that told stories of their battles and achievements. This diverse, thriving world was about to encounter forces that would change everything. The year 1521 marked the beginning of the end for this ancient way of life. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator sailing under the Spanish flag, appeared on the western horizon with ships that seemed to breathe fire and men encased in metal. His mission was twofold: find a western route to the Spice Islands and spread Christianity to the heathen lands of the East. At first, there was cautious cooperation. Local chiefs were curious about these strange visitors with their peculiar customs and powerful weapons. But Magellan wasn't content with trade and diplomacy. He demanded submission to the Spanish crown and conversion to Christianity. Most chiefs, intimidated by Spanish firepower, reluctantly agreed. But not all. On the island of Mactan, a chieftain named Lapu-Lapu refused to bow to foreign authority. When Magellan demanded his submission, Lapu-Lapu's response was simple: "Come and take it." On April 27, 1521, the two forces met in shallow waters off Mactan's shore. Spanish muskets jammed in the humid air, heavy armor became a deadly burden in the surf, and Lapu-Lapu's warriors, half naked but swift and determined, overwhelmed the invaders. Magellan fell to a poisoned bamboo lance, dying not as a conqueror, but as an intruder on a beach whose name he never learned. Yet Magellan's death only delayed the inevitable. Spain had tasted the wealth of the East, and more expeditions followed. In 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi arrived with a different strategy, not just conquest, but colonization. This time, the Spanish came to stay. What followed was one of history's longest colonial periods. Because it was under Spanish rule for 333 years, the Philippines would be transformed more completely than perhaps any other Southeast Asian nation. The Spanish established their capital in Manila, converting it from a small trading post into the western terminus of the first truly global trade network. Silver from Mexico flowed through Manila to China, while Asian goods traveled the same route in reverse. But Spanish colonization came at a terrible price. The encomienda system turned entire communities into virtual slaves, forced to work Spanish lands and pay tribute to distant masters. Catholic friars wielded power that often exceeded that of civil governors, controlling not just souls, but land, labor, and law. Indigenous religions were suppressed, though they never completely disappeared. They simply went underground, blending with Catholic saints in ways that persist today. Resistance never ceased. In the northern mountains, Igorot tribes successfully defended their independence for centuries. In the south, the Muslim sultanates launched raid after raid against Spanish settlements, earning the label Moros, the same name Spanish Christians had given their old Muslim enemies in Iberia. These weren't random attacks, but coordinated campaigns by sovereign rulers, defending their territories against foreign invaders. For over 3 centuries, Spain struggled to knit the islands into a unified colony. They succeeded in creating a shared colonial experience, but they also sparked something they never intended, a growing sense of Filipino identity that transcended the old barangay loyalties. By the 19th century, the winds of change were sweeping across the archipelago. The opening of the Suez Canal brought the Philippines closer to Europe, while the growth of global trade created a wealthy Filipino middle class, the Ilustrados, who could afford to send their children to European universities. There, young Filipinos encountered the radical ideas of the Enlightenment: liberty, equality, the rights of man. Among these student revolutionaries was José Rizal, a brilliant polymath from Calamba, whose novels would awaken a nation's conscience. Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo exposed the rot at the heart of Spanish rule, the hypocrisy of friars who preached poverty while living in luxury, the suffering of Indios ground down by a system that treated them as less than human, the silence of laws that protected only the privileged. Rizal believed in reform, not revolution. He hoped Spain would listen to reason, that justice could bloom within the empire. But history had bloodier plans. While Rizal wielded his pen in Europe, back in the Philippines, a very different kind of revolutionary was emerging from the streets of Manila. Andrés Bonifacio wasn't an ilustrado. He had no European education, no aristocratic connections. But he had something perhaps more valuable: the trust of ordinary Filipinos who were tired of waiting for reform that never came. In 1892, he founded the Katipunan, a secret society that trained in shadows and dreamed of a free Philippines. When Spanish authorities discovered the Katipunan in 1896, the time for peaceful petition had ended. Bonifacio tore up his cedula, his colonial identity card, and declared the birth of a nation. The Philippine Revolution had begun. But revolutions create their own dynamics, and the Katipunan soon fractured. Emilio Aguinaldo, a young general from Cavite, challenged Bonifacio's leadership. In a move that would haunt Filipino history, Bonifacio, the father of the revolution, was arrested by his own comrades, tried for sedition, and executed in the mountains he had hoped to free. Under Aguinaldo's pragmatic leadership, the revolution gained ground. By 1897, Spanish forces were on the defensive, forced to negotiate. The Pact of Biak-na-Bato offered a temporary truce. Aguinaldo would go into exile in exchange for reforms and reparations. It was a pause, not a peace. That pause would prove fateful. Across the Pacific, another empire was stirring. The United States, emboldened by manifest destiny and hungry for overseas markets, declared war on Spain in 1898. When Commodore George Dewey's fleet sailed into Manila Bay and obliterated the Spanish squadron in a matter of hours, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted forever. Aguinaldo returned from exile, believing American support would finally secure Filipino independence. Filipino and American forces fought side by side to encircle Manila. But the Americans had never intended to hand the islands to their Filipino allies. In secret negotiations with Spain, they arranged a mock battle that would give them control of Manila while excluding Filipinos entirely. On June 12, 1898, in Cavite, Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence. A flag was raised, an anthem played, a constitution drafted. The first Philippine Republic was born, but no major power recognized it. In December, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States for $20 million under the Treaty of Paris. Once again, the fate of the archipelago had been decided without consulting its people. What followed was betrayal turned to war. The Philippine War of Independence began on February 4, 1899, and continued for 2 years. The United States needed 126,000 soldiers to subdue the Philippines. This wasn't a clash of equal armies, but of incompatible dreams. Filipino dreams of self-rule against American visions of imperial expansion, disguised as benevolent assimilation. Aguinaldo led a guerrilla campaign that showcased the tactical brilliance Filipinos had learned fighting Spain. But America's response was brutal. Scorched earth tactics, concentration camps, public executions. Entire provinces were punished for supporting the resistance. It began in November of 1899, lasted through the capture of Aguinaldo in 1901, when he was finally captured through deception and forced to swear allegiance to the United States. But the war dragged on in the South, where Muslim resistance in Mindanao and Sulu continued for years. They had never submitted to Spain, and they would not surrender to America without a fight. By 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt declared the conflict over, but beneath the imposed calm, the dream of independence refused to die. American rule brought a different kind of colonialism, one wrapped in the rhetoric of democracy and development. Schools were built, roads constructed, and English became the new language of instruction. A generation of Filipinos grew up reading Jefferson and Lincoln, learning about liberty while living under foreign rule. This education created its own contradiction. How could a people be taught about freedom while being denied it? Into this complex world stepped Manuel Luis Quezon, a political genius who understood both American politics and Filipino aspirations. Rather than confronting the colonial system directly, he mastered it, rising through the Philippine Assembly to become resident commissioner in Washington and eventually Senate president. His strategy was patient and pragmatic. Negotiate independence rather than fight for it. In 1934, his patience paid off. The treaty was hotly debated by the Senate. Ultimately, ratification of the treaty was approved on February 6, 1899, by a vote of 57 in favor and 27 against. The Tidings-McDuffie Act granted the Philippines Commonwealth status and promised full independence after 10 years. Quezon became the first president of this transitional government, and for many Filipinos, it seemed their long wait for freedom was finally ending. But storm clouds were gathering in the Pacific. On December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft bombed Clark Airfield in Manila. The Philippine Army, still under-equipped despite years of American promises, was thrust into chaos. General Douglas MacArthur, who had boasted he could defend the archipelago, watched his forces retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and the fortress island of Corregidor. For months, Filipino and American forces held out against overwhelming odds. Disease, starvation, and relentless attacks wore them down. In April 1942, Bataan fell. Soon after, Corregidor surrendered. Quezon, gravely ill, was evacuated to the United States, where he pleaded for aid that would not come in time. Under Japanese occupation, the Philippines endured 3 years of terror. Puppet governments were installed, collaborators appointed, and civilians subjected to systematic atrocities. Yet resistance never died. Guerrilla units sprang up across the archipelago, farmers, students, and veterans carrying on the fight with whatever weapons they could muster. The Hukbalahap, a communist-led guerrilla force in central Luzon, became both feared by the occupiers and respected by fellow Filipinos. MacArthur, true to his dramatic promise, returned in October 1944. The liberation campaign was brutal, cities reduced to rubble, Manila turned into a battleground where thousands of civilians perished. By mid-1945, Japan was defeated, but the cost was staggering. Over 1 million Filipino lives lost and an economy in ruins. On July 4, 1946, the promise made in 1934 was finally fulfilled. The United States recognized Philippine independence, and Manuel Roxas took office as the first president of the new republic. But independence came with strings attached. Trade agreements that tied the Philippines economically to the United States military bases that remained under American control, and minimal war reparations that left the country to rebuild from ashes largely on its own. The post-war years brought new challenges. The Huck Rebellion, born in wartime resistance, evolved into a communist insurgency. Poverty, corruption, and inequality remained entrenched problems that democratic governments struggled to address. Leaders came and went, Quirino, Magsaysay, Garcia, each grappling with the young nation's contradictions. Then came Ferdinand Marcos, elected in 1965 with promises of discipline and development. For a time, he delivered. Infrastructure projects multiplied, and slogans of a new society echoed across the land. But power corrupted swiftly. In 1972, citing communist threats and civil unrest, Marcos declared martial law. Congress was dissolved, press freedoms vanished, and critics were jailed, tortured, or disappeared. What began as reform spiraled into dictatorship. Cronyism replaced governance, massive debts piled up, and human rights abuses escalated. Yet beneath the repression, resistance grew from churches, student groups, journalists, and ordinary Filipinos who refused to accept tyranny as their fate. One voice in particular pierced through the darkness. Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., a fierce opposition figure who returned from exile in 1983, believing his country needed him. He was assassinated upon arrival, but his death ignited a national awakening that would topple a dictator. 3 years later, the world watched in amazement as the people power revolution unfolded along EDSA Avenue. Unarmed civilians, led by Cardinal Sin, Corazon Aquino, and defecting military officers, stood against tanks and tyranny. Marcos fled into exile, and democracy was restored without a single shot fired. Corazon Aquino, Ninoy's widow, became president, soft-spoken and politically inexperienced, but chosen by the people. Under her leadership, democracy was restored, the constitution rewritten, and civil liberties revived. But the legacy of dictatorship haunted every step, and the republic endured through coups, blackouts, and natural disasters. In the decades that followed, the Philippines danced between progress and setback. Leaders rose with hope and fell under scandal: Estrada, Arroyo, Aquino III, Duterte, each carrying promises and controversy. Through it all, the Filipino people continued to write their story, not as victims, but as survivors, not as subjects, but as citizens of a nation still searching for its truest self. Today, the Philippines stands as a testament to the power of resilience. From those first Austronesian voyagers to the overseas Filipino workers who send remittances home from every corner of the globe, the story remains consistent: a people who refuse to be broken by empire, war, or dictatorship. The history of the Philippines is not one of defeat, but of endurance, of a nation that has bent under the weight of centuries, but never broken, always rising again, with head unbowed and spirit undefeated. In that continuing struggle for identity, sovereignty, and dignity lies perhaps the most Filipino truth of all: that freedom is not a destination, but a journey, and that journey is far from over. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and share it with your friends. I also create videos on the history of different countries and empires, so check out those too.